product their way. And then I don't think electricity gets as much attention. We have interconnection here at the California-Mexico border, and Baja is part of the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, so it's literally integrated into our system here. And so there are several interconnections, some backup interconnections when it comes to electricity. But the point is, there is a huge amount of commercial relationship between our two countries. In fact, that is flourishing and benefiting both countries and consumers and producers on both sides of the border. So with that, let me turn this over. As I briefly introduced, we are going to be hearing a main presentation from Carlos Soule and Joe Amador. And Carlos, as I mentioned, is the co-chair of Baker Bott's Latin America practice, and he focuses primarily on international corporate and finance transactions and obviously on the energy sector and energy industry. He's worked with several clients on a variety of deals and energy project development. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that he was named one of the top 100 lawyers, or one of Latin America's top 100 lawyers in 2014 by Latin Voice. And finally, I'll make sure that I mention he is a member of the Institute of the Americas Steering Committee, and Baker Botts is a great supporter. So thank you for that, Carlos. And Joe Amador, who I'm sure is a familiar name to a lot of you, is also involved very much on the investment side of the energy business. He's managing director of investment banking at Tudor, Pickering, Holt & Company, and spearheads their efforts in Latin America. Joe, before joining Tudor, Pickering, Holt, was at Scotia Waterous, and also served, or I should say, worked for several years at Gaffney Klein Associates, and is actually an engineer by training, so that's always useful to have an engineer presenting as well. So let me throw it over to Carlos to launch the formal presentation. If you have comments, I see folks are already posting some comments there on the chat function. We'll try and get to those. Jacqueline, and thanks Jacqueline Sanchez for her help here. We'll address some of those. So now over to you, Carlos. Thank you again, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank the Institute for hosting us today, and thank you for everyone for listening in. As you said in your remarks, we did not, when we were planning this, we didn't think it'd be as timely as it is, but well, sometimes it's, as the old adage goes, sometimes it's better to be lucky than it is to be good. So in terms of the agenda we've laid out today, the topics we'd like to cover, Joe Amador from Tudor Pickering and myself will tag this. I'll start off with an overview of how week one was in the Trump administration with respect to Mexico and with respect to energy. I'll then transition over to Joe, who will give us an overview of the North American energy trade and give some good statistics and details around the nature of cross-border sales that exist between the United States and Mexico in the natural gas, power, and refined products sectors, as well as crude oil. Then, to the extent you can, we'll try to move a bit beyond the headlines of what the new administration has been tweeting, and try to speculate a little bit as to what some of the policies might actually be that will be implemented in trade and energy. And we'll identify some of the top officials who have been nominated to cabinet positions, but yet confirmed, who will take the laboring oar on putting these policies in place. And then lastly, we'll go back to Joe, who will look into his crystal ball and try to look ahead and forecast some potential scenarios, questions that are out there as to where those scenarios may evolve, as well as the uncertainties that could impact them. So week one for the new administration in Mexico. It was a busy one, particularly the last few days. At the start of the week, President Trump announced his intentions to renegotiate NAFTA. I believe that was either on Monday or Tuesday. On Wednesday, Mexico had its foreign minister and economy minister meeting with top White House officials, including the National Security Advisor and the head of the new National Trade Council, to try to lay out the parameters for a visit that had been scheduled between President Trump and Peña Nieto for next week. At the time they were meeting, President Trump announced put an emphasis on border security and the wall that the administration intends to build, and the wall that the administration intends Mexico to pay for. And then, as a consequence of that, there started being some press leaks about how maybe it didn't make sense for Peña Nieto to come visit Washington next week. Then yesterday morning, in response to those leaks, on the right-hand side here, you had a couple of tweets from President Trump, again reiterating that if Mexico didn't want to pay for the wall, it made no sense to have the meeting. And then back there on the left, Peña Nieto gracefully declined and indicated that it did not make sense for him to visit the United States next week. And interestingly, as one might imagine, on the Mexican side, it's had a little bit of a rally around the flag effect in that at least it's buoyed a little bit of some of Peña Nieto's supporters and poll ratings there within the country for finally standing back up. And not to be outdone this morning, President Trump had another tweet about Mexico on the trade deficit and their need to provide some support with respect to the building of that wall. What about the energy sector? It was a busy week as well. On Tuesday, President Trump signed executive orders to accelerate permitting processes with respect to the Keystone Pipeline, which will bring crude from Canada down into Texas, as well as the Dakota Access Pipeline. He also signed executive orders that will require pipeline builders to use American steel, and he signed executive orders to expedite environmental review and approval processes for a variety of other high-priority infrastructure projects, many of which are in the energy sector, including, for example, the Atlantic Sunrise Pipeline project in Pennsylvania, which is a $3 billion pipeline project to transport oil and gas in the Marcellus Shale, another pipeline project along the Atlantic coast known as the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, and two other stalled projects, interesting, both of which are designed to export energy products to overseas markets: the Gateway Pacific Coal Terminal in Washington and the Jordan Cove LNG project in Oregon. So with that, I'll switch here over to Joe, who'll give us a bit of an overview of the North American energy trade.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank everybody for dialing in today. Look forward to hearing any comments you have after the event. But wanted to talk briefly, just give a little bit of context. Keep in mind the energy business is a long-term business. We're in the middle of a hurricane right now, and I think there's a lot of movement, and at some point we're going to need to look past all that. In general, the energy industry and the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico includes not only cross-border flows of product, but also significant volumes of cross-border flow of dollars and by way of investment. And we're gonna be talking about some of that. But those of you who've heard me talk before, I like to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and it's the general thought is don't do anything drastic yet because it's too early to tell, but you're going to need to be ready for a wide range of possible outcomes. And I think between Brexit and the results of the U.S. elections, don't be surprised for any sort of result. Let's talk briefly about macro in Mexico versus U.S. Mexico is about 2 million square kilometers in area. You can see on the map there on the right. Compares to about 4 million square kilometers in size of the U.S., so about a quarter of the size. About a third of the population of the U.S., GDP of about $1.3 trillion, according to the World Bank. That's close to $10,000 per capita GDP. The foreign direct investment, so this is a cumulative effect through the end of 2015, of the value of investments in Mexico by residents of other countries is about $384 billion. About that ranks Mexico about 19th in the world. It has a number of free trade agreements, including, of course, NAFTA. Oil production is about 2.3 million barrels a day, although the Tudor, Pickering, Holt research is expecting that to drop to somewhere less than 2 million barrels a day by 2020. With MAC actually has a more precipitous drop in production. And refined products, it imports about 2 million barrels a day of refined products, and we'll take a little bit closer look at that here shortly. If you look at the graph here, it's showing the yearly foreign direct investment. This is a year-by-year snapshot as opposed to the cumulative number that I showed you before. But it basically shows the U.S. makes up about half of the FDI going into Mexico, so a significant amount. If we dig into the energy side of the business and look at some of the cross flows, it's interesting to see that U.S. imports some oil, about 700,000 barrels a day from Mexico. A lot of that going just to the Shell Deer Park refinery and other Gulf Coast refineries. But what's really interesting is about 3 million barrels a day coming in from Canada. And that number may be growing here shortly, depending on the outcome of the XL Keystone pipeline. Natural gas flows. This particular statistic came from the BP statistical review from last year of about 3 BCF a day. But as you can tell on this slide, it is growing. What was less than a BCF a day back in 2010 is now pushing 4.5 BCF a day through a variety of pipeline networks. It should be noted the U.S. total natural gas production is 29 BCF. The overall production of the country, which is flowing into Mexico. Jeremy mentioned earlier by about 17 pipelines that cross border. This map shows what happens to the natural gas once it's inside Mexico. There's a network of pipelines. A number quoted by IPD Latin America a few years ago was about 18,000 kilometers of pipelines in existence and anticipated to be built, I think through about 2018, or about 11,000 kilometers in existence. That compares to 300,000 miles in Texas alone. So significant opportunity for further investment in Mexico. We see some of the players there. In as much as refined products, again, Jeremy mentioned earlier, there's about 1 million barrels a day of refined products flowing into Mexico. A year and a half ago, it was about half that volume. So again, a substantial increase in refined products going into Mexico. In as much as the power business, the cross-border flows do not represent really that large of a volume. They make up about 1/100% of the U.S. electricity use. But what's really interesting there is the growing power demand within Mexico, and the fact that natural gas makes up about 40% of the fuel that is used and will be used by those plants. So a lot of what we were seeing earlier is part of that flow into the thermal plants, into the combined cycle, but many more that are currently planned, and therefore more volumes of natural gas in theory heading down. Another figure from, again, IPD was 14 plants that were being planned by CFE for about $8 billion. So again, a significant investment opportunity for U.S. and other countries. So this takes a quick look at who the players are in Mexico right now. These are the key players. We're of course missing a few names here, but in the upstream space, we see Chevron, Murphy, ExxonMobil that recently entered by way of round 1.4. That was the Deepwater round that occurred back in December. Lewis Energy, a company out of San Antonio, was really a first mover. They've been in Mexico for a long time, well over 10 years, by way of one of their multiple service contracts in the north. A couple of private equity firms, NCAP, Riverstone, that they both own Sierra Oil, or investors in Sierra Oil and Gas. Talos, and we're missing Fieldwood there as two companies that were early entrants. They acquired blocks in rounds 1.1 and 1.2. In the services sector, there's a long history there with Mexico. Halliburton, Baker, Weatherford, and some of the other service companies, some of the drillers providing Pemex rigs and other services. And down below is really where most of the investment has occurred over the last years. The infrastructure sector was opened way before this recent energy reform, and we see some of the names there that are in Mexico, as well as some of the projects that they're associated with. To give you a better idea of the capital that has been committed, and some has actually, a significant amount has been spent, we're showing here about $5 billion worth of investments. What's interesting is, again, most of that is in infrastructure, and the announced projects, the announced investments historically have been in infrastructure. These are some names you may not recognize: First Reserve, Sempra, KKR, BlackRock, and of course ExxonMobil, Chevron. And you really start digging in and ask yourself, well, who actually owns these entities? And to a large extent, the main investors or significant investors are pension funds, retirement funds, people with 401ks. So by jeopardizing investments that these companies have made in Mexico, you're essentially you're impacting a lot of the U.S. investors. Let me hand this back to Carlos to talk a little bit about policies.
Thanks, Joe. So sort of looking beyond the Twitter feeds and the headlines that have been garnered, what are some of the specifics in terms of what the president has indicated, or the president or his nominees in confirmation hearings have indicated that they intend to examine here? Obviously, what's garnered the headlines this morning was this concept of a new 20% tax on Mexican imports that was leaked in a White House press conference, but then later in the evening, the White House chief of staff seemed to backtrack a bit to indicate it was just among the many options that was out there. And interestingly, that's a concept that has been floated before in prior Republican congressional tax reform proposals. Another topic that's been floated out there as a way to fund the border wall would be to have a tax on remittances that Mexicans living here in the United States send back to Mexico. I think in 2014 that amount was about $25 billion, and so that's a significant capital flow that goes back and forth. All of that being said, it's important to note that any of those types of actions will require congressional legislation, and so it's going to be notwithstanding that you have Republican majorities in both houses, it's still going to be a bit of a process to get that through. What about in terms of renegotiating NAFTA? On that front, a couple of years ago, President Obama was granted significant fast-track negotiating authority, and President Trump continues to enjoy that. So that means the president has broad authority to renegotiate a trade agreement and then simply present it to Congress for an up or down vote where it can't be amended. Interestingly, in terms of withdrawing from NAFTA, any nation can withdraw from NAFTA upon 6 months' notice. Mexico, so far, at least in some of the trade rhetoric that existed this week, indicated that they can't get a good deal, then they might be willing to consider that. What about specifics in terms of actually making some revisions to NAFTA? Well, there are a variety of specifics that the Commerce Secretary nominee has suggested, as well as the head of the Trade Council. Those include issues such as rules of origin, which are the rules that determine how much content made in North America will allow a product exported from Mexico to the U.S. to get NAFTA treatment. There's been discussion of trying to increase that amount. Another is the Chapter 19 of NAFTA relates to when there's a trade dispute, the arbitration panels that are used to resolve those trade disputes under NAFTA. There are some critics, and there is some who perceive those arbitration panels as being favorable to Canadian or Mexican interests and intending to rule against U.S. ones. So there's been discussion about revising those. Another topic is the VAT treatment of U.S. imports to Mexico. Many point out that when NAFTA was executed in the 90s, Mexico's VAT was about 10%. It's now risen to about 16%. And when a good leaves the United States and goes to Mexico, it's subject to that VAT. But when a good leaves Mexico and comes to the United States, it's not accounted for. And so some critics argue that that's a disadvantage to U.S. exports. Another item that might be a little easier to address would be the de minimis value that allows for expedited customs processing. In the U.S., that value is $800. Mexico and Canada have lower thresholds, so that would seem like a relatively easy topic to address that would benefit small business. Another item that's out there, when NAFTA was negotiated in the 90s, you didn't have e-commerce, and you had a monopolized Mexican energy sector that was owned by the state. Those are two developments that have occurred since then, so NAFTA could be revised to address those topics. And then lastly, notwithstanding that President Trump indicated the U.S.'s withdrawal from TPP, it had extensively revised provisions on labor rights, environmental issues, intellectual property, and so there could be an effort to try to incorporate some of those concepts into revisions for NAFTA. What about the President's agenda for the energy industry? Generally, it's from an energy industry perspective, there have been very positive themes. He's mentioned opening up federal lands for exploration and production, reducing regulations on coal, reducing subsidies in wind and solar power, obviously redirecting energy efforts towards the natural resources, also wanting to promote hydropower as well as nuclear power, and then interestingly, an export-oriented vision of increasing and simplifying permitting processes for natural gas export facilities, obviously talking about LNG. So then who are some of the officials beyond the President and the White House staff that will be influential on trade and energy matters? There's the Secretary of Commerce nominee, Wilbur Ross, who is, as we indicated in his confirmation hearings, he got through the Senate committee, but he's yet to be confirmed by the Senate, but the expectation is that he will be, and he has indicated that renegotiating NAFTA is at the top of his list, as well as taking a tougher trade stance with China. The USTR representative nominee, his confirmation hearings have not yet started, but presumably he should get through. The National Trade Council Chair, Peter Navarro, that's a White House staff member that doesn't require a confirmation hearing. And although the Secretary of State traditionally has a bit of a limited role on trade matters, it nonetheless is an international matter of significance. And given Rex Tillerson's prior career in the energy industry, I think it's a safe bet that he'll have a voice in terms of the impacts that the energy industry has on trade and the effects that it could have as a result. In terms of energy matters, we highlight the Secretary of Energy, Rick Perry, who's from an oil and gas state here in Texas, and the EPA Administrator, who was also from Oklahoma, another oil and gas state. He was the Attorney General there. So then, looking ahead, Joe, what do you see in this ominous-looking crystal ball here?
The ominous-looking crystal ball has actually a lot of questions. Let's look at some of these questions, uncertainties. We'll start with the macro level, and there are obviously many of them. I've just listed a couple, and that we think are quite relevant to the future of the energy industry. And one of them is, of course, the impact that this is going to have and has already had on Mexican politics. We've already begun to see some rhetoric. And with presidential elections coming up in mid-2018, that's just going to be a staccato of rhetoric leading up to the event. And that's, of course, going to impact things in the South and the possible reaction from Washington. The weakness of the peso is really interesting because it's a bit of a double-edged sword. It makes Mexican exports cheaper. And also makes labor there less expensive. So for companies considering manufacturing in Mexico, it actually positions the country quite attractively. So the question is, will U.S. companies increase their investments? And again, very possibly, again, because of the lower labor costs in Mexico, notwithstanding any potential impact from taxes and other fiscal issues that we might look at. In the energy sector itself, we talked earlier, I showed that slide about the volume of crude oil coming in from Canada, and I think if we look at the Keystone XL, I believe it has a capacity of, 607,000 barrels a day, so that could actually push volumes up towards the 4 million barrel a day mark coming in from Canada, and that's about the volume that Mexico exports to the U.S., so it's also heavy crude, but it's really a function of the arrangements that particularly Pemex may have with the Shell Deer Park refinery as to how much that particular crude can be displaced, or if it's going to be crude from other countries that is displaced from by way of that Keystone XL, if it does get built. Tariffs on imported crude, possibly. There's talk of 20% import tariff, and crude may or may not make it on that list. Natural gas exports, with a continued increased demand for energy in Mexico by way of continued enhancement or growth in the country's economy, you would anticipate higher and higher volumes of natural gas going into the country. The reverse would also be true if the economy in Mexico stagnates or begins to decline. You may see a lowering of those volumes. Tariffs for natural gas exports. Again, natural gas exports is a bit of a question mark, because that's inexpensive energy going down to Mexico to fuel industry that may be competing against the U.S. So the administration needs to think carefully on that one. Easing regulations in the U.S. keeps capital in the U.S., detracts investors' interests, and really the question is, the second round, licensing round by the CNH is up and running. Will less U.S. investors be looking at Mexico, given the potential for opening more areas here in the U.S., for reduction in regulations? In other words, as an investor, given the choice between throwing more money towards the Permian, Bakken, Eagle Ford, Marcellus, DJ, etc., does it make sense for me to instead go down to Mexico? So the Mexican government needs to think a little bit about that and the impact that could have, not only there, but in the joint ventures that Pemex is now looking forward to obtaining. And then the big question is, okay, so if it's not the U.S. player, who is it? And is it the Asian national oil companies such as CNOOC, Sinopec, CNPC, Sinochem, that will be replacing the U.S. CNOOC already obtained 2 deep water blocks in round 1.4, and this could be more of a broader question: is, will Mexico shift towards a different preferred partner? Will the Chinese come in to replace the U.S. as the partner of choice? So as we think about investors, I kind of see them in 3 groups. Those that are highly invested, and we saw slides earlier about the midstream sector and the companies that have already invested heavily in that sector. Lewis Energy, another company that has been in Mexico for quite some time. Another group is those who are committed, those who, for instance, obtain blocks, the Fieldwood, the Taluses, the Chevrons, and have committed to work programs going forward. And then there are those that are either still on the sidelines or tried but were unsuccessful and still have not invested but are seriously considering Mexico. And these three optics, each of them is going to have to look at this possible outcome in very different ways. For those who are considering going in, do you buy something? For those who are there, do we grow the business? Or the other extreme, do we sell? Do we exit? Do we reduce exposure? Do we find a local partner? Or if you're still considering, do we just wait and see what happens? And the third option, of course, of harvesting what you have there, not growing, not selling, but waiting. So I think generally the recommendation here that I mentioned early on, it's definitely time to study your options, probably not take any radical action yet. So if we look at these three scenarios, the first one is probably what's on everybody's mind given the rhetoric and the tweeting war that has been occurring recently, and this is a position of somewhat antagonism between the two brothers, which could lead to a slowdown in the Mexico economy, could lead to a slowdown in the U.S. economy. We of course would see a decreased demand in Mexico for U.S. energy exports in that case. Will we actually be seeing these increases in tariffs and lower exports either from the U.S. to Mexico or vice versa? What I asked earlier, the replacement of the U.S. investors by investors from some other country that says, "Wow, what a great opportunity to be entering Mexico now that I have less competition." You have the status quo, which is a case where things things don't get approved. Washington goes into a stalemate of quarreling. A good time to be a lawyer. Plenty to do in that case. Or again, what may not be readily apparent but could actually be an outcome is a bigger pie. Washington realizes that it's probably better to have a bustling economy in Mexico. Keeps the people down there because they have jobs, more opportunity to sell products from the U.S. into Mexico, and proceeds with either lower tariffs or not changing the existing tariffs, and more enhancement of trade between the countries. Again, as odd as that may seem, recall last year was somewhat the year of surprises. So, Carlos, what do you think?
So I think as a conclusion, we've learned that a Trump presidency for the next 4 years will be unconventional and unorthodox. There is not a conventional wisdom, at least the way things have been looked at. So we'll offer these concluding remarks that it's become sort of a catchy buzz phrase from World War II England, which used to be keep calm and carry on, but as this slogan here says, keep calm and expect the unexpected. So with that, Jeremy, we'll send it back to you and let us know what questions we have from the audience.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you all. There's a lot of material. Really appreciate you all working together to put that up for us today. And keep calm and expect the unexpected. That is a perfect way to end this. I think we all, as much as we try to expect the unexpected, we're still having a fairly difficult time. At least I will speak for myself. Just a quick reminder, everyone, the chat function, the chat bar is how, okay, I'm sorry if you can't hear me. The chat bar is where you pose the questions. Can you hear me okay now? Just give me a quick yes on the chat function to make sure. Okay, thank you. So again, a reminder to use the chat function to pose your questions. Let me ask something to both of you all, a very broad table setting kind of question. And I think, Joe, you began to allude to it a lot in some of your crystal ball, the ominous looking crystal ball, as Carlos called it. A lot of friends and neighbors say to me, who don't follow sort of the binational relationship or let alone the energy, but they say to me, well, isn't it in the United States' best interest to boost the Mexican economy and not harm it? So how do you respond to that? And Joe, why don't we start with you, and Carlos, look forward to your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, it's a point I mentioned in that prior slide. and that is the bigger pie is probably better in both cases. And if you look at history, if you look at other countries, and you know, if you go back and look at what's really happened over the last years with NAFTA in place between the three North American countries, it's you know, generally been favorable. The problem you have is once you begin a trade war, there's retaliation, and at the end, you know, you end up hurting both sides of the border.
No, I completely agree with Joe. But like I said, it's difficult to sort of speculate as to the thinking and what's going on. It certainly is. It's unorthodox and unconventional in the first week before you have your Secretary of State, much less your Secretary of Commerce, who's going to be responsible for negotiating these matters, that to engage in what you have. But that's the new style and the new tenor. And you know, tactically, strategically, there's been much focus on China as well too. So from a trade perspective. So I'm sure the Chinese are watching this and trying to discern what they can from it. So I think it's just one where it's going to be a tumultuous ride. And while there are things that you can control, they're going to it certainly does have the potential for unleashing forces in events that you can't control. Certainly, Mexico's got, as Joe indicated, an election here in 2018, and if you look at the sort of, it's almost like every 12 years the Mexican left gives a good run at things. In '94, you had Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas against Salinas, who had a very tight election, and then López Obrador with Felipe Calderón. So you know, there is a question mark if 2018 will be the year that the Mexican left breaks through at the presidential level.
Excellent. No, there's a lot for sure in the Mexican political side of this to track in the coming months, and certainly up until next July 2018. We're getting several questions. I see some of them are quite easy, so we'll start to pose those. But let me end with well, I have one more I wanted to get on the table here, and it's something, Joe, you laid out nicely some of the companies, but also the private equity that's gone into Mexico since the energy reforms of a couple years ago. And then you hinted, I think, later into where a certain investment stays in the U.S. I'm just curious, specific to private equity, is that one of the areas where you see a perhaps pause button being hit?
You know, there are some private equity firms that are deeply invested in Mexico. We saw those. Some have already gone in by way of the infrastructure sector, whether it's pipelines, power. There's actually quite a bit of power being exported to California from Mexico from one of the solar generators in Mexico, and I think that is mainly backed by one of the private equity funds. But there are still a number of them who are on the sideline, and of course they're sitting, whether it's in Houston, New York, London, Toronto, and looking south, going, okay, given the uncertainty there, what does it make more sense for me to do if I have this money that I need to put to work? And the U.S. unconventional environment, the Permian Basin, the Eagle Ford, to name just two, seem to have an insatiable appetite for investors and vice versa. So we can see we may be able to see somewhat of a pause at this point until there's more clarity, and you know, with the upcoming licensing rounds, 2.1, 2.2 in particular, there are probably some that are scratching their heads, going, okay, is this the one I'm going to sit out, or is this just a bump in the road because I need to look out 5, 10, 15 years from now and think how things are going to be then, might this just not be a good opportunity for me to go in, because maybe there are a lot of others that are going to be sitting on the sideline and there won't be as much competition.
Excellent. Carlos, anything to add to that? Thanks, Joe.
No, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, obviously, the private equity sector is varied in terms of the investment profiles each fund takes. Some funds or take on more risk than others, but certainly political risk is always a factor in their decision making. And if you look at Latin America hemispherically in the last half century, last decade at least, you get market openings and you get market closings, so to speak. And Mexico has generally been an open market for foreign investment. And how industry views if that will continue, or if it's one where they see a potential for a more inward-facing political regime, then maybe they'll view it differently. But I think it's one where for those who aren't there, this might for those investors that aren't already in country, this might be a reason to pause. But for those who are there already, they have to evaluate it and navigate through it.
Excellent, thank you. We've got several questions here, a lot of them in terms of economic outlook. But let me start with one that is a bit of your thoughts on Rex Tillerson as the presumptive Secretary of State. I think we're just waiting on a formal confirmation. But Carlos, you alluded a little bit to obviously his ExxonMobil career. But any quick thoughts you guys have on that appointment?
I mean, I think he's been around the world and he's negotiated with heads of state, so this will be nothing new for him. And he certainly understands geopolitics. So he's I think got great potential. And then in terms of how it impacts trade in Mexico, I think he'll bring an energy perspective to the discussions that may not be readily apparent. Many of the trade statistics that get thrown out there in terms of the trade deficit fail to account for some of the figures that Joe cited. So I think you have to look at it holistically, and I think he should be a voice of reason.
Excellent. Joe, any quick thoughts?
No, along the lines of course, I mean, Mr. Tillerson is extremely well-versed, internationally disciplined, coming from 30, 40 years of ExxonMobil culture, very much by the book. He's going to have his challenges, but he's definitely an outstanding negotiator, and as Carlos said, the voice of reason.
Excellent. Well, we'll wait on this confirmation, and then we'll see what happens. Speaking of seeing what happens, there's an interesting question here, and we are getting into this tea leaf reading, as I think I described to both of you in my idea to put this together. But the question is, if you had any thoughts on what a quote-unquote base scenario will look like in terms of the coming months and years. So Joe, maybe your thoughts on a quote-unquote base scenario for the U.S.-Mexico energy outlook.
Why don't you give me an easy question?
Well, you did go through various scenarios, so I.
As much dust as is being thrown around, I think you really need to look past and try to sort out what actually can happen in the next 4, maybe 8 years that is going to have a lasting impact. It's just such an unknown. I mean, Jeremy, a year ago this week, we were all fighting for survival because oil was somewhere in the high 20s. And so year to year things change dramatically. Thank goodness this change didn't come with a low oil price. Also, it would have been quite a difficult environment to swim through. But there's a good possibility that things will just get tangled up in Congress. And end up being with being a lot of inactivity. Granted, The Republicans do control at this point, but I don't believe everybody in the party is aligned. So I don't think any of what we're hearing here is a slam dunk, that it's not a slam dunk that it will be approved. And the question is, can it just get log jammed long enough that that by the time there's another administration, things will not have changed too much?
Okay. Carlos, any thoughts on that, Ted?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the here sort of the near term, near next couple of months, you've got volatility and headlines and noise. You've got to get the U.S. departments filled and the main negotiators in place, i.e., the Secretary of Commerce and the USTR, to start renegotiating NAFTA. And I would say that the big variable out there is if there is a president who domestically, poll ratings wise, is more unpopular than Trump, it's Peña Nieto, whose ratings were in the teens at the start of this week. They may have moved up. But what happens in those in Mexico's 2018 elections, which are around the corner, is this going to create this nationalistic fervor where Mexico is going to follow what the UK did with Brexit and what the US has done with Trump, and when they move that direction, if they do, then I think then Joe's antagonistic scenario becomes more likely. But I'm an optimist, so I think this is a lot of noise, and where we're going to end up is Joe's last scenario of there's some elements of NAFTA that can get modernized, and the voice of reason will prevail, and it'll be a win-win for both sides. But it's going to be a bumpy road to get there.
My dad always liked the turn of phrase, cooler heads prevail. So that'll be my 2 cents there. How about the U.S. economic growth outlook? There's a question here for your thoughts on that. I mean, obviously, we've been talking a lot about the specific bilateral energy and trade relations. What about just the United States economic outlook? I know that's a difficult one, given everything we've already talked about. But just any quick thoughts on that, Joe, Carlos?
The Dow Jones is at an all-time high. So investors at this point are extremely bullish on what the administration's policies could do for the U.S. You combine that with what is an extremely low unemployment rate, and you kind of need to scratch your head and go, okay, now how are all these new jobs going to be filled, and how is all this expansion going to take place? So a lot of it is going to depend again on just how much of these agreements, NAFTA and the like, are negotiated. Things could actually turn to the negative, but again, I'm assuming that the economy in the U.S. will continue to grow, will continue to be attractive. We will see where the Dow Jones is 4 years from now. I don't think anybody expected it to be where it is today, back when President Obama began his second term, but it's definitely moved in a favorable direction.
I mean, with that, 2016 was a not very great year in terms of GDP growth, though, right? So a lot of things to figure out. Any thoughts, Carlos?
No.
Yeah.
Just
Okay.
simple lawyer.
And I'm an engineer.
That's right. Perfect. All right. Well, so let's move on to we'll take some stuff that's more up both the alley here. But let's there's a couple of things there are different questions that I want to get to. Both of them we're going to run out of time soon, but let's take the NAFTA renegotiation piece first. I do want to get to the question about renewables in Mexico, but let's look at NAFTA first. And this is an interesting question. I mean, talk about a crystal ball here. What would NAFTA's energy chapter look like after the renegotiation? Carlos, why don't we start with you, the humble lawyer?
So I think NAFTA, like I indicated, was negotiated in the 90s, so there are elements of it that should be modernized, and the TPP included provisions around the energy sector that I think many would argue should be incorporated into NAFTA. Obviously, what complicates taking the TPP and trying to move it into NAFTA is there were a lot of trade-offs that were made as part of that negotiation. But that being said, I think that's one of the elements where, on the specifics of what it will look like, I'm not sure, but I do think it will. I do think it will be addressed.
Joe, any thoughts?
No, I'll pass. I'll let the lawyer take that one.
Perfect. Well, let's take a question here. What do you think of a potential tax on natural gas exports to Mexico? And so take that. I think we've heard a lot of talk in the last 24 hours of import taxes, but what about this concept or idea of a tax on natural gas exports?
I don't. I know it was in our presentation. I don't really see that as something that the current administration would do. But again, you never know.
It would, as Joe says, it seems unlikely. In addition to what you've heard from the administration, particularly if you look at Wilbur Ross's testimony in his confirmation hearings, in addition to talking about, well, we're going to renegotiate NAFTA, he also put a strong theme on we're going to focus on U.S. exports. And as we highlighted, some of the projects that will benefit from, as we highlighted on the LNG side, the administration wants to accelerate approval processes for those types of projects. So you wouldn't think they would do a measure to discourage taxes in that consequence. But the variable that you don't know about is how the negotiations will evolve. Will it become more of a scorched earth negotiation, and/or some of the when LNG projects, some of the LNG projects, export projects that have gone online in the last few years, the political opposition they faced was from domestic industry, which wanted to keep cheap natural gas home, keep the pricing lower to benefit domestic production. So if that element of the president's advisory circle gets his attention in his ear, then there's the potential for it. But it certainly seems unlikely given the broader voices that exist within the cabinet in terms of Rick Perry as well as Tillerson.
Yeah, that's a delicate balance to play, whereby in one case you want higher natural gas prices so you can extract more resources, so that you can drill more wells, keep more truck drivers busy, and frack more wells. There's a lot of investment. There are a lot of jobs associated with that. But the flip side is now you have more gas. What do you do with it? And is the U.S. economy going to grow at a quick enough pace to absorb this natural gas? Probably not. And if not, what's the safety valve? Your safety valve, you're not going to send it to Canada. Canada has way too much already.
And your outlets for your natural gas, you only have a couple of ways to transport it. One is by pipeline, one is by an LNG tanker. And it's a lot cheaper, and you can ship a lot more out by a pipe than you can a tanker. And so that all argues against the idea of something like that. But as we said, expect the unexpected, so you never know.
No, absolutely. And I think these are the exact things the whole purpose of this webinar and having these conversations at this point in time, as I indicated at the outset, is to make sure we all really get a good understanding and everyone conveys how robust and how interconnected our markets are, whether it's foreign investment, whether it's energy trade, and to this ultimate point here of Mexico has become, like you said, Carlos, an outlet. It has become a destination for some of the excess natural gas capacity. So I wonder if, with gas prices being so low, if without that Mexican outlet, how bad it would really be. So taking that and looking inside Mexico, there's an interesting question about what happens with renewables and distributed generation technologies And do you see that playing a bigger role in power generation in Mexico in case this natural gas trade, the importation of cheaper U.S. natural gas into Mexico gets, let's say, altered, or the apple cart gets upset?
So I think if you look at the last couple of electricity auctions in Mexico, they've been focused on the renewable sector, and that's been a significant element of the energy reform. And so I think one could expect to continue to see that. That being said, there's still very significant infrastructure within country that's dependent on natural gas, and so while you might see renewables continue to grow, it's got a long way to go before it displaces natural gas.
It's interesting that the policies of the two countries could differ, because if you recall from one of our slides, President Trump's agenda leans towards a reduction in subsidies for wind and solar, whereas really the rest of the world, Mexico, Argentina, a lot of the European countries are leaning hard towards solar and wind power, and particularly Mexico. Having said that, Mexico does have a lot of natural gas, associated and non-associated. It's really a function of how feasible is it to produce at what would be a competitive price vis-a-vis Henry Hub. But again, if you start slapping export tariffs on natural gas, thereby making the import price higher in Mexico, that would probably lead to direct investment in Mexico natural gas, in the natural gas sector, more attractive. So you would probably push business towards Mexico with companies, locals and others, taking advantage of that and producing natural gas back home.
Great. No, I think you guys make some good points. And just to add that, Mexico has tried to carve out a hemispheric, if not global, leadership role on energy transition and incorporation of renewables in terms of a national clean energy target, as well as efforts to develop a clean energy mechanism. So and Carlos, you mentioned the two auctions where renewables, wind and solar, did indeed compete quite aggressively, and both of those were oversold. So one more item to keep our eyes on. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I did want to put this final question. It's a bit of a good wrap up, and I don't know if none of us here work for the administration, but the question is, how aware is the new administration of the post-facts reactions in Mexico vis-a-vis politicians in the positions where they may have no alternative but to respond by either dropping NAFTA or leaving the United States and not negotiating. And I think this leads to some of the things that Carlos alluded to in terms of the Lopez Obrador potential. So I guess the question is, when you say how aware, so how aware are folks who are coming into the administration, maybe not at this most senior level, but more at the working level in Washington, the extent of everything we've talked about this morning? I'll let you all decide who goes first on that.
Thank you, Rodolfo, for that question. But no, it's a good question. Definitely one to think about. It would seem that you need to live in a bubble not to realize just how attractive populism has become in Latin America. We are seeing the effects in Venezuela. Fortunately, Argentina veered the other way more recently, but it kind of went through its own cycle. And is Mexico being put in a position to head left and to turn towards business and political partners that may not see eye to eye with the U.S. If it's not readily apparent, it definitely needs to be. I'm not sure what the most effective way is to send that message, but being from the region and having followed it very closely all my life, yeah, you you see that Mexico and others can very quickly turn to the left and stay there for quite a long time.
I agree with Joe, and regardless of how attuned they may be or not be, there's obviously a different view or agenda, and at the very least, there was certainly insensitivity to having to making an announcement about how you're building a wall the same day the foreign minister from that nation is visiting to talk about a visit between heads of state the upcoming week. So I think the hope is today President Trump is meeting with the Prime Minister of the UK. So hopefully we'll get a weekend full of headlines about the special relationship between the United States and the UK, and the president moves down his agenda, and the firestorm that kicked up this week dies down, and negotiations and cooler reasoning can prevail here in these next few months.
Keep calm and expect the unexpected, going back to your borrowing from the Great Britain in World War II. So that's a perfect way to wrap this all up. I want to thank you both again, Carlos Sole of Baker Botts and Joe Amador of Tudor, Pickering, Holt and Company, for your time and insights this morning. Thank you so much. And I want to call everyone's attention to the next roundtable, our in-country in Mexico City. We'll be getting into a lot of these issues, maybe not so much the U.S. side of it, but more specifically, a lot of the things we've talked about here in terms of regulations, institution, and particularly the continuity question and how Mexico can continue to consolidate the energy reform, particularly when it comes to upstream oil and gas. So we hope you can join us February 28th in Mexico City. It's just after 9 o'clock here in La Jolla. We'll let everyone go. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. It's been an extremely interesting conversation, and beyond the conclusion of expect unexpected, I think the other thing I would say is let's stay tuned and keep it tuned here to the Institute of the Americas. We will continue to convene discussions and again, with the intention of trying to make sure we don't let what's a flourishing relationship get otherwise compromised. So thanks again, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you.